Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing with the course on the history of Catholicism in the United States. This is the third installment in the unit on colonialism and slavery. We'll pick up where we left off last time. In 1524, the King of France, at that point Francis, named for his country Francis I, commissioned a professional Italian mariner named Giovanni de Verenzano to explore the Atlantic coast of the newly discovered lands, looking for another way to get to Asia. You remember, that's what started this whole thing. Columbus thought that by sailing west from Europe, he would get to Asia faster than the Portuguese, who were trying to get there by sailing, well, eventually they did, get there by sailing all the way around Africa. And obviously Columbus ran into the Americas, but they didn't know at the time how large the Americas were. They thought, okay, it's just some body of land, and even those who did think it was part of Asia, they knew it was not China or Japan or India, which is what they were looking for, because those places had been visited and commerce was taking place over the Silk Road, over land. So they had accounts of what those places looked like, and there was no resemblance between that and what the Europeans were finding in the Americas. So the King of France commissioned this guy to find a way around the Americas to get to Asia, and this is the beginning of the Northwest Passage. What they thought, okay, that's going to be the way that we'll get around the Americas to get to Asia. Verenzano, he ran into North America, and he sailed up from South Carolina, what later became South Carolina, north up the Atlantic coast to Newfoundland. He discovered the Hudson River and New York Bay, but he did not attempt to make any settlements. One member of his crew was named Jacques Cartier, who was going to loom larger than Verenzano in the history of North American exploration. On October 13th, 1525, another diocese was established. This is another New World suffragan diocese of the Archdiocese of Seville, not Rome. Remember, because of the problem that we talked about last time. This was the Diocese of Las Cala, the first suffragan diocese established on the continent, on the Americas. This Diocese of Las Cala controlled ecclesial activity, which would mean clerical missionary activity, in Western Spanish America, which in the colonial period included what is now Mexico, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. So this is where Verenzano he ran into what later became the Carolinas, and he sailed up, and up, and then Hudson. I don't know. But anyway, you can see New York, New York there, and Quebec. So Las Cala, well, it's probably not, but the Spanish New Spain, what they called New Spain, the Spanish called New Spain, included Mexico, and then up into Texas all the way over to California. and they had two Californias. There was Alta California, which is this upper California that we think of as the state, and then Baja California was the south, and then Mexico all the way down. This map is not as detailed, but you can see the perspective more. So the what later became the viceroyalty of New Spain, including Mexico and what is now the western United States, all the way down the peninsula, but did not include Panama. That was a different viceroyalty. Of what is Colombia? The New Granada, they called it, was Colombia, Venezuela, and Panama, and then the viceroyalty of Peru, included other, was now Peru, Chile, Bolivia, and then Brazil was not Spain. Brazil was Portuguese colony. Okay, so from this diocese of La Scala would emanate many others. The Diocese of Mexico on September 2nd, 1530. From the Diocese of Mexico, the Diocese of Michoacan would be carved out on August the 11th, 1536. The bishops of Michoacan exercised ecclesiastical jurisdiction over the region that would become the state of Texas until the 18th century, when it shifted to the newly created Diocese of Linares on December 15th, 1777. Texas remained under this ecclesiastical jurisdiction until the creation of the Diocese of Galveston, Texas, which is within the present state of Texas, on May 4th, 1847. But La Scala started it all on the continent, October 13th, 1525. Okay, the following year, 1526, the first African slaves land in part of what would eventually become the United States was located on Sapelo Island off the coast of Georgia, established by a Spanish government official named Lucas Vasquez with 600 settlers. They named the colony San Miguel de Guadalupe. One member of the colony was a Dominican, acting as chaplain, whom we've already met, the Friar Antonio de Montesinos. And we met him with his 1511 denunciation of encomenderos on the island of Hispaniola, which is why he was no longer on the island of Hispaniola. In 1532, sugarcane was first cultivated in Brazil, Portuguese colony. This would have incalculable effects on the history and the economy of the New World and of Africa. Estimates range between 10 million and 20 million Africans were enslaved in the New World to service the plantation economy. And this is Brazil here in South America. So by orienting ourselves, so you see right here, up here, that's New Orleans. And where I am is a suburb of it's in the Archdiocese of New Orleans, but just outside. So this is where I'm speaking to you from here. And so to orient Brazil is down here, South America. Sugarcane is actually a grass. You wouldn't think of it because it grows so big, but is a species Saccharum officinarum. It grows in stalks that are fibrous stalks that are jointed, and the joints is where the sucrose collects. And they're huge. They can grow to 6 feet, 12 feet even, depending on the climate and how, the nutrients they have. The sucrose accumulates in the nodes, and that's harvested for sugar, table sugar, as well as molasses and rum. And today, it can be chemically milled into ethanol. Even today, 80% of the sugar on the planet, that's consumed on the planet, comes from sugarcane. And of that 80%, 40% of it still comes from Brazil. So you may well, okay, 80% of the sugar is from cane. Where's the rest come from? Well, it comes from beets, that's a different chemical process. But in terms of the slavery and colonialism, the cane sugar is the more important, as we shall see. So it became a cash crop, plantations developed. And the purpose of plantation is a large-scale planting enterprise to produce a cash crop, like sugarcane. So here is one account of life on a sugarcane plantation from someone who witnessed it. Quote, at 4 o'clock in the morning, the plantation bell rings to call the slaves into the field. About 9 o'clock, they have a half hour for breakfast, which they take in the field. Again, they fall to work until 11 o'clock or noon. The bell rings and the slaves are dispersed in the neighborhood to pick up natural grass and weeds for the horses and the cattle, and to prepare and eat their own lunch. Notice at lunchtime, they have to pick grass to feed the animals first, then they're allowed to eat. At 2 o'clock, the bell summons them to deliver in their grass and to work in the fields. About half an hour before sunset, they are again required to collect grass, not for themselves, for the animals. About 7 o'clock in the evening or later, according to the season, deliver grass as before. The slaves are then dismissed to return to their huts, picking up brushwood or dry cow dung to prepare supper and tomorrow's breakfast. They go to sleep about midnight. Then remember, at 4 o'clock in the morning, the plantation bell rings to call the slaves into the field after going to sleep at midnight 4 hours earlier. The cane was first cultivated in Brazil in 1532. 2 years later, France commenced exploring the New World in a more organized fashion, 1534, with Jacques Cartier. A native of Brittany, which is western France, he sailed from France to explore the commercial possibilities of the land he had helped survey as part of the Verrazano expedition 10 years earlier. This process brought Catholicism to the northern part of North America, and which included the transfer of colonists from France to northeast North America, and that population included the ancestors of the Acadians, who are the ancestors of the Cajuns of Louisiana, about whom more to come. Cartier made landfall on the Gaspé Peninsula, where the expedition's chaplain offered the first Mass on July 7th, 1534. They sailed up the St. Lawrence River, set up a cross on its banks, claiming the valley for King Francis I of France on July 24th, 1534. Cartier encountered a tribe of indigenous people who turned out to be part of the Iroquois Confederation. and attempting to ask them the name of the land by pointing to their settlement. He heard them saying a word that sounded to his French ear like Kanata. They kept repeating that. So in his log, he called the new land Canada. But in fact, the word the Indians were using was simply their word for village. So he pointed to that, yeah, that's our village, that's a Kanata. Not to the whole land. The St. Lawrence River was so vast by European standards that Cartier was certain it would provide the Northwest Passage to get to Asia, thereby succeeding where the Spanish and Portuguese had thus far failed. He established contact with a number of the tribes of the indigenous peoples. He recorded the economic possibilities of the area, animal pelts, timber, as well as the abundance of wildlife and fresh water, which he felt made colonization feasible and desirable. Now his record reflects, so this is July, so his record reflects the summer. And Canada is beautiful, territory in the spring and the summer. But in his law, he had not yet been through a Canadian winter. So he's looking at, obviously it took him so long across the Atlantic that in order to get, even if the Northwest Passage is existed, they'd have to have colonies to resupply the ships. And eventually to expand to build new ships. That's what the value of the timber. Anyway, his logs after the winter would reflect a different attitude about the beauty of the landscape. Cartier turned out to be one of the most accomplished mariners of the age of exploration, the age of great mariners. He led 3 separate expeditions back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean, so across 6 times, in other words. And he finally died of an epidemic, not in the New World, but in France, back home, in 1557. He was a meticulous cartographer. In his exploration, he mapped over 50 harbors and bays, and all of this, he did it without losing a single ship. He was also very cautious. He had that rare blend, he had the kind of adventurous spirit that's necessary to motivate someone to do all of this, but also had the caution to be prudent when necessary. So this is a better record than Columbus, who did lose a number of men and ships. Back to the Spanish colony. Oh, I'll show you where this was. So we're going to visit this area again because of the Cajuns. This is probably not the best map, but it's close enough. So this is the St. Lawrence River. So you see, which now the state of Maine. Here's the St. Lawrence River. Quebec is on the river. Quebec refers to the province as well as to the city, Quebec City. And then further down is Montreal, and then the Great Lakes here, and Canada up here, and the states down here. So Maine, which now the state of Maine, would be considered for the early part of American history, part of this Massachusetts. But then you have down here New York and Pennsylvania, Ohio, to orient yourself. So we'll visit that area again to do justice to our Cajun brothers and sisters down here in Louisiana, to review where they came from and why they left that area. Meanwhile, back to the Spanish colonies. Catholic missionaries were having striking success in converting the indigenous peoples in the New World. Once baptized, at this early period, they were technically protected from enslavement. The problem with the missionaries' success was that it deprived the encomenderos of the slave labor they needed to work their mines and their plantations. So the encomenderos retaliated against the church by trying to twist the law to their advantage. They argued, or had, paid people, paid advocates, lobbyists as we call them today, argue back in Spain before the royal court that the baptism of the Indians, as they were calling the indigenous people, the baptism of the Indians was invalid because the Indians were not really human, because the Indians did not have a soul. Therefore, if the baptism was invalid, then they were not Catholic, and that they were not protected from enslavement. Now let that sink in. Right? It's rather startling, first, that this argument would be made, but even more so that it was being taken seriously. But it was being taken seriously. So the Pope had to make a statement. The Pope at the time was Paul III, and his statement was Sublimus Deus, dated June 2nd, 1537. And this is an excerpt. The sublime God so loved the human race that he created man in such wise that he might participate not only in the good that other creatures enjoy, but endowed him with capacity to attain to the inaccessible and invisible supreme good. The enemy of the human race, who opposes all good deeds in order to bring men to destruction, beholding and envying this, invented a means never before heard of, by which he might hinder the preaching of God's word of salvation to the people. He inspired his satellites abroad, that the Indians of the West and the South, and other people of whom we have recent knowledge, should be treated as dumb brutes, created for our service, pretending that they are incapable of receiving the Catholic faith. By virtue of our apostolic authority, we define and declare by this present letter that the said Indians and other peoples should be converted to the faith of Jesus Christ by preaching the word of God and by the example of good and holy living. It is essential to take note that official papal teaching herein attributed to Satan the development of the Atlantic trade in African slaves. So the enemy of the human race, that's Satan. Now, we cannot deny that Spain and Portugal were officially Catholic monarchies, but their actions cannot be attributed to the Catholic Church, since now we're up to three popes made declarations against slavery that have been promulgated over 2 generations since the bringing of the Americas into the European sphere of influence. So now the church gets blamed, for basically everything that goes wrong, and so we get blamed for this. But we're not. That's just simply not accurate. It's not. It doesn't mean people are going to stop blaming us, but I just want you to know that. 3 years later, in Spanish America, a Catholic initiative once more found that it had to rely on the military. So a Catholic expedition had to join a military expedition. It transpired as follows. In February of 1540, 27 years after Ponce de Leon explored Florida, and he was not looking for the fountain of youth, right? He was looking for gold. So 27 years after that, the Spanish expanded their exploration into the Western American holdings. In that year, Francisco Coronado led an expedition north to the Rio Grande River to follow the Colorado River and explored the areas which later became New Mexico and Colorado. He brought Franciscan friars with him, Father Juan de Padilla, Father Juan de la Cruz, and a brother, Luis de Obeda, Luis de D-E, then Ubeda, Ubeda, along with 6 others. In what is now later became New Mexico, the expedition encountered the Anasazi. The Spanish called them the Pueblo, after their adobe clay huts. The Anasazi had a very well-organized agrarian society structured around villages. The Anasazi feared raids from other indigenous tribes who had a different method of resource acquisition. They were hunter-warrior tribes, such as the Apache and the Navajo, who would raid the Anasazi settlements. So the Anasazi feared the Apache and the Navajo as much as the Spaniards came to fear the Apache and the Navajo. The Franciscans were excited by this discovery of the Anasazi because they were culturally, they were monogamous in their marriage practices, and their religion was based on dance rituals to appease the elemental and ancestor spirits, which were the most important in their way of life. They did not practice hematomancy, blood magic. So they did not kill humans or animals, but killing the humans, that's by way of contrast to the Aztecs, who did practice human sacrifice on a massive scale. So the Franciscans were excited because they said, okay, these people, we have less to remove from their culture. In other words, like preaching to the Aztecs, well, human sacrifice was part of the structure of their society, and so that was so to remove that was really to change a great deal of their society. Whereas we're at the Anasazi, just their dance rituals, they don't even have to stop them from dancing. It's just that, to give them the proper theology to understand, and according, like Las Casas, who was not involved in this, but his attitude of could be applied, that if an indigenous practice was not repugnant to the gospel, like human sacrifice, then it could be incorporated. Because of the possibilities they presented, 3 of the Franciscans stayed behind after Coronado abandoned the area in disgust because he had not found gold. The friars worked for 2 years to establish, among the Anasazi culture. After the 2 years, 3 of them became the proto-martyrs of the United States, meaning the first martyrs within the borders of what later became the United States. When they were massacred in eastern Colorado or western Kansas, it's not exactly certain, not by the Anasazi, but by Apache. It was an Apache war band who were raiding the Anasazi that the Franciscans were with. And so they all just got killed. On November 30th, 1542, Juan de Padilla was killed in probably Kansas. Luis de Escalona, it's thought that he was at another village near what is Pecos, New Mexico. The account is derived from a member of the Coronado expedition named Pedro de Castaneda, who later went to visit him. I mean, he made friends with the Franciscans, and he left with Coronado, and then after Coronado gave up, he went back he was going to go stay with the Franciscans and live with them and live among the Anasazi. And then he found the remnants. He saw the ruins of the villages, and then he looked around, followed water sources until he found some more Anasazi, and then found out what happened to him, and that's how the account got preserved. That was 1542. In the same year, there was a change in royal policy. Still faithful to his vocation as an advocate for the Indians, Bartolome de las Casas, whom we met last time, traveled to Spain again, and actually did it 2 years earlier in 1540, but it took him 2 years of work to get done what I'm about to summarize. His plan was to use the Pope's teaching in Sublimus Deus to push for greater legal protection for the indigenous people. Now that the Pope had clarified that they are indeed human beings and they do have a soul, therefore baptizing them is valid, and baptizing them is something that we should do. Using this papal teaching, he lobbied for 2 years. Very frustrating 2 years, but eventually achieved success for a change in royal policy, codified in the New Laws, as they were called, the New Laws of 1542, enacted by Charles V in his capacity as King of Spain. And in that enumeration, he's King Carlos I. He was also Holy Roman Emperor. I talk about all that in the medieval course, in the section on the Carolingians, and the unit on the Carolingians. So as Holy Roman Emperor, this guy was Charles V, but in Spanish history, he's Carlos I. And the new laws forbade the enslavement or the forced labor of the Indians, based on the Pope's teaching. It ended the practice of hereditary encomienda and placed the Indians under the protection of the crown. So the law was changed, but Spain was very far away from the scene of the crime, where this stuff was going on. In the following year, 1543, the King of Spain obtained from the Holy See the right to draw boundary lines for new dioceses, as Rome had no way of doing so because of ignorance of the geography. And the viceroys who represented the king extrapolated from this the right to draw boundaries for new parishes. Again, the church had to concede this out of necessity. Certainly not an ideal situation. 5 years later, 1548, the ecclesiastical jurisdiction over Spanish California was rearranged. It was under the Diocese of Michoacan until the Diocese of Guadalajara was created on July 13th, 1548. California was transferred to the newly created Diocese of Durango on September 28th, 1620. And from that was carved out from that was the Diocese of Sonora on May 7th, 1779. Then the Diocese of the Two Californias was created. That's what it was called initially, the Two Californias, meaning Baja California and then Alta California, which is present day the state of California. That diocese was created on April 27th, 1840. And that takes us out of the colonial period into the early national period. So we'll visit that again. But we'll shortly encounter Junipero Serra bringing Catholicism to this region. That's why I mention it. Anyway, so the change of that area from Michoacan to Guadalajara happened in 1548. The following year, in 1549, Dominicans attempted to evangelize the indigenous peoples of Florida, this time without the protection of the Spanish military, hoping that their efforts would be more successful without the inevitable rapes, brutality, theft that the mercenaries, the conquistadors, inflicted. So let's see. All right, so the Spanish were operating from the south, because it's off this map. But when they in the Caribbean, they colonized the Caribbean islands first, and then you have Cuba down here. We talked about that, and then Mexico, where they landed at Veracruz, which is just south off this map, and then up to Mexico. So they have the diocese, La Scala, then Mexico, then Michoacan, then Guadalajara had this area with California. But then over here, which we talked about last time, it was the Diocese of Havana that organized. So it was Spanish Dominicans from Cuba, well, from Spain, then Cuba, but you know what I mean, they based at Cuba, crossed over to the peninsula that is Ponce de Leon named Florida to try to evangelize. Now, this was not the first attempt. It was not the first time that clergy had been there, but it was the first time that they attempted to do it without the protection of the military. So it was an experiment. They tried, because they saw the abuses. I mean, they knew Las Casas was a Dominican. I mean, so that they knew what was going on, and they understood why, and they also knew they didn't have any way to stop it, except to not get involved. So that this was an attempt to do that, and we'll see how that worked out. This was Father. They were led by the friar Father Luis de Barbastro and Diego de Tolosa. They were both priests, along with a Brother Fuentes. They first attempted to evangelize the Tocobaga near present-day Tampa Bay, and they were beaten to death. So they became the proto-martyrs of Florida. The perennial problem that the missionaries faced was not the one most expected. They expected, because of prior European history in the Middle Ages, dealing with pagans, they expected the main problem to be just preaching against the indigenous religion, and that would trigger the reaction. But it wasn't. The problem was because the pagan religion of the indigenous people in Florida was animist rather than pagan. So, in other words, animism, the word anima means spirit. So, animism is a type of, obviously non-theist religion, but they believe that occurrences in the natural world, the physical universe, were imbued with spirits that were sentient and that were supernatural and had to be appeased. So trees, rivers, waterfalls, those things had spirit. So they did not have the personal deities that, say, the Scandinavian and Germanic barbarians had, who killed so many early missionaries because the missionaries are preaching against Odin, and so that it was a different kind of religion. So the natives were willing to listen to the Tocobaga, they were willing to listen to the stories of other religions and even to practice it. But initially they just practiced it alongside their own religion. Yet the concept of having only one religion, initially it just didn't make any sense to them, because they had different categories. So they didn't even have the Greco-Roman pre-Christian categories of the Olympian gods. That these anthropomorphic deities that the missionaries in Europe had to wean people away from. They didn't even think of those terms. For them, to reverence and honor the animus, the spirit of a waterfall, that they wouldn't think of that as like a church. That they would think of that as that's just something you do. That's just part of life, because that water is part of life, and the spirit of that water is something that you want to keep. You want to keep on good terms with. So that was part of a problem. They weren't thinking in Western categories. They weren't thinking in Greco-Roman categories, and why would they? When the tribal people, as it turned out, when the indigenous tribes did turn violent against the missionaries, the reasons were either a reaction against physical or sexual assault by soldiers against tribal women, or primal mob violence in reaction to the sudden appearance of previously unknown illnesses like measles and smallpox, which had hideous mortality rates among them because they had no natural immunity. These diseases developed after their ancestors crossed over from East Asia, across the ice bridge, during the Ice Age, when they could just literally walk from Asia to the Americas. And then the Americas got cut off when the sea levels rose after the glaciers melted. And it was after that that these kind of diseases, smallpox and measles, develop. So they had no immunity at all. It just wasn't part of their DNA. Another category of violence, provocation of violence, was when the friars preached against and attempted to halt tribal practices of polygamy. Now, that didn't apply to all of the indigenous people. They didn't all practice polygamy. As we saw, the Anasazi did not, but some did. And when the friars tried to stop that, that was another occasion that could provoke violence against them. So keep that in mind. Moving forward, on September 30th, 1558, the Viceroy of New Spain, Don Luis de Velasco, gathered an expedition of 500 Spaniards, of whom 400 were soldiers. 6 Dominicans were assigned to care for the spiritual needs of the colonists and to oversee the initial conversion of the Indians in Florida, making this the second attempt by the Dominicans to bring Catholicism to Florida. The expedition failed. The whole expedition failed. It was not just the religious part. And the whole attempt was abandoned in 1561. Don Velasco mentioned at the end of his letter, his report to the king, who by this point was Philip II, that he was sending 3 religious to the new mines of Saint Martin, which were 30 between the mines of Zacatecas and Copala. So at least 3 of the Dominicans survived that expedition. But then, he wasn't happy, and so he's sending them to be chaplain to people who work in the mines. On the 20th of March, 1565, an agreement was reached between King Philip II of Spain and Pedro Menendez de Aviles for the annexation, the conquest of Florida to the Spanish Empire, and the assignment of Jesuit missionaries this time. So now they're disappointed the Dominicans struck out twice, and now, so they're going to try the Jesuits. King Philip granted to Pedro Menendez de Aviles an asiento, which was a royal patent, a royal charter, bestowing title and revenues to him and his heirs if he managed to conquer the land. He was to bring along 10 to 12 religious of an order of his choice to minister to the colonists, plus 4 others, specifically of the Jesuit order, as missionaries to the Indians. By this point, the Jesuits had developed a reputation for language acquisition. Menendez's plan was to muster 500 men in the Bay of Cadiz in Spain. They sailed in May, to sail in May of 1565. Before departing, before May, the Spanish decided to destroy a French outpost called Fort Carrollton, located, just for the sake of confusion, not in what is now Carolina, but in what is now Jacksonville. So Menendez's mission was adjusted to encompass elimination of the French outpost, which was installed by French Huguenots, French Protestants. And for that, he was empowered as an adelanto, having much more broad civil jurisdiction as well as military. Almost simultaneously, a French captain named Jean Ribault was dispatched from France to reinforce Fort Carrollton. So the 2 fleets, who don't know about each other, ran into each other, and they engaged off the coast. But it was not a decisive engagement, either tactically or strategically. So it was just like a little brawl, and then they separated to fight another day. On August 28th, 1565, the feast day of St. Augustine, Menendez landed, so the settlement that he established was called St. Augustine, and that's on the Atlantic side of Florida. It was installed in a former Timothy village, chosen for both its defensibility as well as its proximity to fresh water, an artesian spring. Here, in St. Augustine, Menendez held the first Catholic Mass in the new colony. Not the first one in Florida, but in the new colony of St. Augustine. And in due course, he managed to eject the French Calvinists from Fort Carrollton, hanging those that he captured. So you see ethnic hatred, but it's not, it's everywhere. So the French and the Spanish were enemies at this point. Other times the Spanish and the English are enemies. Certainly the French and the English were enemies. And it just goes on and on and on. And Satan has a field day with that. As long as we're slaughtering each other, we hate each other, then we're not building up the kingdom. The St. Augustine that he built was complete with a fortress, a town, and a church. This church became the first canonical parish within the present borders of the United States, though the first church had been San Miguel on Sapelo Island off the Georgia coast in 1526, which already mentioned. By the end of 1565, St. Augustine had 1,000 Spanish colonists served by 4 priests. In 1566, the first Jesuits arrived within the present borders of the United States. Fathers Pedro Martinez and Juan Rogel, with a brother, Francisco. They just came on the ship with reinforcements for the Florida colony at St. Augustine. On the way, before they landed, a storm blew them off course, and they made landfall, or swam ashore, in what would become Georgia, the state of Georgia, which at that point was claimed by Spain. They figured out that they were too far north as opposed to too far south, so they just turned south and just started walking. They just figured it would be as if they fell to the coast. They knew St. Augustine was on the coast, so that if you just walk south along the coast, eventually we're going to find it. But along the way, they were attacked. Father Martinez was clubbed to death in one attack near Jacksonville, what became Jacksonville, along with many other Spaniards. But the other 2 Jesuits survived and did make it back to St. Augustine. So Pedro Martinez is the first Jesuit martyr within the present borders of the United States. And retroactively, after the guys made it, they tried to, okay, how long exactly was it? They figured out, they think, and so the date is chosen as October 6th, 1566. 2 years later, in 68, 10 more Spanish Jesuits arrived in Florida, establishing missions in what would become Fort Myers, Miami, and Tampa. So the Fort Myers, that was among the Calusa, Miami was among the Tegesta, and Tampa was among the Tocobaga, as well as outside of Florida in what would become South Carolina. They established a base at Santa Elena, as well as they at least walked through Georgia and Virginia, and we'll see what happened in Virginia later. The Spanish made it as far as present-day Maryland. So I know some of you're watching this, some old Maryland friends from the CUA days. So the Jesuits, Spanish Jesuits, made it as far as Maryland, and they found the Chesapeake. They named it the Bay of the Mother of God. An Indian boy had been rescued from a storm and sent to Spain for 10 years in the hopes that he could return to the New World as a guide and a translator. But the Jesuits brought him with them. His Spanish name, was Don Luis. When this group, which was led by the Jesuit priest Father Juan Baptiste Segura, began exploring the James River, which empties into the Chesapeake. Don Luis, for the first time, made contact with his own tribe again, for the first time in 10 years. And he was of a tribe that belonged to the Algonquin sort of confederation. And he immediately, relapsed to his pagan ways. He was tempted to return because the Algonquins practiced polygamy, whereas Don Luis had been living among the Jews, been living like a religious, so, for 10 years he had no, well, to be polite, I mean, he had not been on a date, in 10 years. The Jesuits tried to persuade him to return, but he refused, but he was afraid they were going to force him to return, just as he had just been sent off to Spain for 10 years, without dinner. So he convinced the local Algonquin that the Jesuits were enemies. And all but one of the Jesuits were murdered in an ambush in February of 1571. These are 8 Spanish Jesuits in what is now Virginia. 4 brothers, 1 novice, 2 priests. The only survivor of the expedition was a young servant who was kept as a slave by the Indians. When the Spanish from Florida arrived to find the Jesuits, they found out what happened, and then they did what soldiers do. They started killing Indians in reprisal. This captured youth, escaped. He ran to the Spanish when he could, and he's the one that told the story of what exactly happened, of Don Luis's betrayal. Don Luis was never captured, but it is said that in 1587, he was the Indian chief responsible for the failure of the English Roanoke colony, and in 1622, that he was the Indian chief who tried to wipe out the English settlements at Jamestown. This was the last attempt by the Spanish to colonize the area that is now Virginia. This represented a turning point in history because this abandonment meant that there was no effective military presence to oppose the English from later settling the east coast of North America. Had the Spanish been able to hold, and if their colony had flourished, it's possible that the history of the region would be very different in terms of the Catholic history, in terms of the Catholic faith. 1 month after the Virginia Jesuits were martyred, the St. Francis Borgia withdrew the Jesuits from the Florida missions. And that decision was March 20th, 1571. This guy Borgia was the Master General, the Superior General of the Jesuit Order. He wrote to Pedro Menendez and the St. Augustine colony, explaining why he was withdrawing the Jesuits from Florida. In part, he wrote, quote, "They have worked and suffered with a constancy that has been manifest, and yet they have seen little or no fruit of their labors, which is the greatest suffering for all those who seek only the good of souls for the greater glory of God. Since, therefore, those pagans are so badly disposed that they are said to prefer the devil and to go to hell with him rather than to God, it must not be fitting to keep the company in that land," meaning the Society of Jesus in that land. Excuse me. Sorry about that. 2 years later, in 1573, Spanish Franciscans took over the Florida missions. For 185 years, they worked among the tribes of Florida, the Calusa, the Timucua, the Guale, Tocobaga. The abundance of deer, fishing, and the possibility of cultivating maize meant that large-scale hunger was never a threat, as it was for the indigenous people in other parts of North America, like in the Western Spanish territory. At its greatest extent, the Franciscan missions in Florida consisted of 40 mission stations and 100,000 indigenous converts baptized as Christians. The ongoing problem they faced was that of polygamy. The tribes refused to give it up. Time and again, the friars would learn that men who had accepted baptism were actually secretly keeping more than one wife and family. This issue did at times precipitate violence. The Franciscans pushed too hard. In 1597, for example, there was an uprising among the Guale against the Franciscan effort to force them to choose one wife. And in the ensuing violence, 5 Franciscans were killed. Nevertheless, the friars persevered. By 1612, the Franciscans had a catechism, a dictionary, and a grammar composed in the Timucuan language. Now, turning for a moment to the English settlements, the English sphere of North America, 11 years after the Franciscans took over the Florida missions. 1584, Roanoke Island was England's first American colony. The English the English privateer, Sir Walter Raleigh, sponsored a colony effort after a reconnaissance of the Atlantic coast, which lasted from April through September of 1584. When a second expedition returned with colonists, they landed on Roanoke Island on July 27th, 1585, to establish a colony, which is in present-day North Carolina. On August 18th, 1587, the first birth of an English child within the borders of what would become the United States took place. She was named Virginia Dare, D-A-R-E. She was the granddaughter of the expedition leader, John White, through his daughter, Eleanor. 1 week later, on August 25th, White himself returned to England to obtain supplies, because the colonists had proven to have limited skills at cultivating the land, owing to expending their time searching for gold, instead of planting crops. And then, okay, summer's over and, winter's going to come and, we don't have enough to get through the winter. His return was delayed by the threat of the Spanish Armada to invade England. So White was not able to return for another 3 years. On August 17th, 1590, he made it back. He found the remains of the colony. It was abandoned. He found letters scratched into a doorpost, indicated that they had sought refuge, or at least he deduced what it meant, is that they had sought refuge with Croatoan. So he assumed that was a tribe, which had been friendly. So he went looking, but he was not able to find any of the settlers or the tribe, if it was a tribe. So the colony was abandoned, and he never learned the fate of his daughter or granddaughter. Theories range about this, about what happened. Believe that there's a whole sub-literature on this. Some just assume, okay, they must have been massacred by the Indians. Maybe they weren't. Maybe this Croatoan, maybe it was a tribe, and they were just adopted into the tribe, and the tribe relocated for some reason. Maybe all of them, the tribe as well as the colonists, were enslaved and executed by the Algonquins of Don Luis, who had betrayed the group of Spanish Jesuits. Or maybe Croatoan refers to a cryptid, to a beast, previously unknown, of an unknown species. And maybe the beast wiped them out, and the reason there were no remains is that the beast ate them all. So there's look it up. I'm not making this up. That this is. I mean, obviously this is. I'm being, but it is a thing. It's like the first appearance of a version of Bigfoot. A cryptid, a secret beast, the Loch Ness monster. All right. The event did provide the name for the capital of the future state of North Carolina, Raleigh, as well as the name for a county in that state, Dare County. 20 years after the Roanoke failure, the French returned to Canada. In 1604, a commercial colony was contracted by the French monarchy to a private entrepreneur named Pierre de Gois de Monts to exploit the potential of the fur trade in Canada. He paid for 2 priests who were intended to serve the needs of the French colonist. One of those priests, Father Nicholas Aubry, on his own initiative, began reaching out to the indigenous people, trying to find a way to explain Christianity to them. He was de facto, not by appointment, but de facto was the first Christian missionary in Canada. So he was employed, so to speak, just to provide sacraments to the French colonists, but on his own he tried. So he reached out, he learned some of the language. I mean, probably never became fluent, but enough to, kind of communicate. He was the first, 1604, the first de facto French missionary in Canada. The cartographer, the mapmaker of this expedition, later became the true father of French Canada, Samuel Champlain. He picked up the legacy temporarily halted by Jacques Cartier's early death, and he made that legacy permanent. On his map, he referred to the area of eastern Canada and Maine as Acadia, A-C-A-D-I-A. That's a contraction of a classical reference to Arcadia. Arcadia was the region of the Peloponnesus, the peninsula that sticks out of southern Greece. The region known in mythology, Greek mythology, for its mountains, its trees, and its natural beauty. This was the first area of Canada to be seriously settled by the French, and it was a beautiful area, like the myths all say Arcadia was. So that's why it was called Acadia. And this is the ultimate birthplace of the Acadians, who later became the Cajuns of Louisiana after escaping ethnic and religious pogrom by the British beginning in 1755, about which we will, we'll have more to say in due course. 3 years later, in the English sphere, bringing us to 1607, we witnessed the establishment of Jamestown, Virginia, the first English settlement on the American mainland to endure. Virginia later became the 10th of the United States on June 25th, 1788. At the time, 1607, it was controlled by the London-based Virginia Company, which had a royal charter to do this. In terms of religion, the managers were all Anglican, because it still is the state religion in England. But at this period, Anglicanism was being influenced by King James I, whom, the seminarians will remember from a previous course, that James I tried to blend Calvinist austerity with support of the Anglican establishment. As the Anglicans had clergy, they had a hierarchy, bishops and priests, deacons, whereas the Calvinists, the Puritans, did not. But James wanted that. He wanted that hierarchy basically clergy on the payroll, Anglican clergy on the payroll, to be a support for the government. And he blended that, and he actually wrote a book on this, to preach and teach about the divine right of kings as linked with apostolic succession. Anyway, the religious laws of this Virginia colony are illuminating. Written in 1609 by Sir Thomas Gates, when he landed, or after he landed, on May 23rd, 1610. The document is titled Laws, Divine, Moral, and Martial. They included the death penalty for sodomy, incest, rape, adultery, gambling on the Sabbath, and after the third absence from Sunday services. Attendance at daily services was mandatory. First violation for missing was 1 day with no food or water. Second violation was a public whipping, flogging. Third violation, 6 months incarceration. Fourth offense, banishment, thrown out into the wild, which is, basically death. Further, murmuring against the governor or any other royal official was punished by public whipping, followed by humiliation display in the stocks. And then after that, this punishment still isn't over. Then you have to publicly beg for forgiveness on knees at a Sunday service in front of the assembled community for murmuring against the governor or government officials. So this is interesting in itself as a snapshot of history, especially our interest in religious history. This document is also illuminating in terms of the development in the region of what would become the United States. Both the Anglican English colonies under the direct patronage of the crown, as well as later colonies we're going to meet, which were English, but were founded by Calvinist Protestants or other non-conforming Protestants. They were established by private companies, not by the crown, to escape subordination to the established Church of England, to the Anglican Church. All right, so from a Catholic perspective, they're both they're all Protestants, meaning that they're descended from those who broke from Rome over issues of authority, papal authority, issues of sacramental theology, and in the case of Calvinists, also our theology of grace, many differences. But all the Protestant, they all had different ecclesiologies, different ways that their churches were structured internally. So as I said, the Anglicans retained, they believed that they were part of the apostolic succession. So they had bishops, they had priests, they have services that, somebody walking in, it looks very much like the Catholic Mass, even though the theology of it is different. Whereas the Calvinists were much more like the Puritans, those are Calvinist English. They're very much, they just want the white wall church, no priesthood, no bishops, no holy orders, no sacramental holy orders. Their ministers were preachers. Very, extreme simplicity inside of the church, all biblical, just, and the services just consisted of reading from the Bible, singing songs, like Psalms from the Bible. And they regarded the Church of England as too papist. Moreover, since the Church of England was the established church, they had to pay taxes to support it. And they didn't want that, So first they didn't believe that that was the correct way to worship and practice Christianity, but then they also felt that their money was being stolen to support something they didn't believe in. At the same time, they on their own, if they wanted to have their own ministers, they had to support their own ministers. So it's like a double religious tax added to all the other taxes that they had to pay, because they had other taxes to pay to support the government. So all these, the Crown, using the Anglicans as well as Calvinists and other nonconforming Protestants on their own, established colonies on the east coast of North America. As it turned out, they did not get along with each other. Even though from a Catholic perspective they're all Protestant, yet they didn't get along with each other. And often, fought with each other as much as they fought against Catholics. So that's indicative to keep in mind how the country is going to develop. The colonial period and then in the national period. In the long term, this dynamic meant that the adoption of John Locke's views on church-state separation were not only a matter of conviction, but also one of necessity. If the eventual 13 colonies the English established were to unite as a nation, religiously they could not tolerate each other any more than they could Roman Catholics. So they would never be able to agree on which church to establish. Like the Calvinists did not want the Anglican Church to be established. They didn't want to pay taxes to that. Yet the Anglicans, obviously, they didn't want to have to pay taxes to support a Calvinist church. And neither one, of course, would devote a penny to support the Catholic Church. And the Catholics felt the same way about all of them. So, the separation of church and state, while we take it as just an axiomatic of our republic, and it certainly is, but it was a matter of necessity from the beginning for religious reasons. That's the point I'm trying to make. Okay. So they had the necessary compromise was to outlaw the establishment of any church at all. All right, the following year, back in Canada, the French sphere, July 3rd, 1609, Samuel Champlain founded Quebec City at the confluence of the St. Charles and the St. Lawrence rivers. It served as his base of operations, so it was the de facto capital of French Canada, colonial Canada. Champlain was a commoner by birth. And remember that this monarchy, this aristocratic society, highly structured society, not a free society, hierarchical society. So he was not of sufficiently noble birth to be appointed governor of a French colony. But functionally, he actually did the work of a governor until his death. He died of a stroke in the city that he founded. All right, so I'm going to read an excerpt from his work. So the area he's talking about. All right, I got to come up with a better way to do this. But all right, so here's what later became Maine. So down here's the United States. Up here is Canada. All right, so this is the St. Lawrence River. This is the bay and then the river. All right, and down the river, I don't know if you can even see it. But right there is Quebec. All right, that's Quebec. Now, this whole area of eastern Canada, you see Newfoundland and Nova Scotia Island. Okay, well, yeah, it's gonna, and Prince Edward Island and New Brunswick, what the Canadians today call the Maritime Provinces. This area was Acadia, where the Cajuns are going to come from. And so here's, go down to Quebec, and then further down is Montreal. Then over here is the Great Lakes. So in the excerpt I'm reading, he's talking about how the French got established here. So this is the nucleus of what's going to become Acadia, and the homeland of the Cajuns, which is Catholic, which is Catholic Canada. All right, so this is an excerpt from his works on the foundation of Quebec, dated the year 1608. Quote, I proceeded to Honfleur for embarkation, where I found the vessel of Pontgrave, that's his uncle. in readiness. He left port on the 5th of April. I left on the 13th, arriving at the Grand Bank on the 15th of May, in latitude 45 east, 15 degrees. On the 26th, we sighted Cape St. Mary, latitude 46 degrees east, 45 north, on the island of Newfoundland. On the 27th of the month, we sighted Cape St. Lawrence, and on Cape Breton, and also the island of St. Paul. Well, and those are all, it's Eastern Canada he's talking about. All right, skipping down. On the 3rd of June, we arrived before Tadoussac, which is a fur trading post on the St. Lawrence, established by his uncle, Point Grave. Distant from the Gaspé, that's a peninsula in Eastern Canada, 80 to 90 leagues. Remember, a league is 3 miles. We anchored in the roadstead of Tadoussac, a league distant from the harbor. It goes on like that. Our vessel was unable to enter the harbor as the wind and tide were unfavorable. I at once had the boat lowered in order to go to the port and ascertain whether Point Grave, his uncle, had arrived. While on the way, I met a chalupa, a small boat, with the pilot of Point Grave and a Basque. Basque refers to an ethnic group. In sort of southern France, the Pyrenees, and northern Spain. It's an ancient ethnic group. They're not French and they're not Spanish. Ethnographers, it's believed that their language, the Basque language, is actually like a proto-language. Like they were there when the Ice Age ended. So their language is not based on any others. They were just like there. Anyway, it's a distinct ethnic group, distinct culture. But Basque people ended up getting involved in the history of France and Spain just because they were there. So Point Grave, the pilot of Point Grave and a Basque came to inform me of what happened to them because they attempted to hinder other Basque vessels from trading, according to the commission obtained by Sieur de Monts. Sieur de Monts, that was Pierre Dugas de Monts. He was a French merchant who received the license from the French crown to do this in 1603, and he's the one who recruited. He's supposed to recruit 60 colonists a year, and he's the one who recruited Champlain as well as Champlain's uncle. Well, the uncle first, and then Champlain. All right, so these other, the Basques people are crossing into the turf as they see the advantage of the fur trade, and they don't care what the King of France said. They found that it's a lucrative thing. Okay, well, we can go kill animals and take the furs and bring them back and make money, and we don't care if the King of France said that that's reserved to you. So the fighting broke out. Right, so this is a turf fight. They did not desist from forcibly carrying on their traffic, and they used their arms and maintained themselves so well in their vessels that, discharging all their cannon upon that of Point Grave and letting off many musket shots, he was severely wounded. That's Champlain's uncle, together with 3 of his men, one of whom died. Point Grave, meanwhile, making no resistance, for at the first shower of musketry he was struck down. The Basques came on board of the vessel and took away all the cannon and arms, declaring that they would trade, notwithstanding the prohibition of the king. So in other words, the French got spanked in this case. The Basques, had their way. In this place were a number of savages. Now, I'm sorry, that is his word. So he's referring to the indigenous people. He's calling them, that's not me. I'm not calling them savage. But that's a number of, he uses that word, I'll say indigenous people, who had come for a traffic in furs, several of whom came to our vessels with their canoes. The canoes are from 8 to 9 paces long, about a pace or a pace and a half broad in their middle, growing narrower toward the 2 ends. They are very apt to turn over in case one does not understand managing them, and are made of birch bark, strengthened on the inside by ribs of white cedar, very neatly arranged. They are so light that a man can easily carry it. Meanwhile, I managed to visit some parts of the river Sanguinet, a fine river which has the incredible depth of 150 to 200 fathoms. The Saguenay is a tributary of the St. Lawrence. It empties into the St. Lawrence. So where the Saguenay meets the St. Lawrence is where Champlain's uncle, Pontgravé, founded a trading post of Tadoussac. And all that's still there. I mean, there's still the name of the river. There's still Tadoussac's still there. Just as Quebec is still there. All right, it goes on. This indigenous people told me that after passing the first fall, they meet with 8 others when they go to a day's journey without finding any. Then they pass 10 others and enter a lake, which they are 3 days in crossing. That's one of the Great Lakes. And they are easily able to make leagues a day upstream. At the end of the lake, there dwells a migratory people. Of the 3 rivers which flow into this lake, one comes from the north, very near the sea, where they consider, all right, it goes on like that. But the people at the other end of the lake, we're going to meet them shortly, so keep them in mind. Champlain is going to get involved in a pre-existing dispute between them and other tribes of indigenous people. And many French are going to end up dying over that, including the Jesuit martyrs, the North American Jesuit martyrs. So keep that in mind. That's going to be later in the century. All right. The indigenous people carry the merchandise we give them for the furs, such as beaver, marten, lynx, and others, which are found there in large numbers, and which they then carry to our vessels. I set out from Tadoussac the last day of the month to go to Quebec. We passed near the island, distance, it goes on and on. Then a river, we named it Salmon River because we caught some salmon in it. Coasting up the north side, we came to a point extended into the river, which we call Cape Dauphin, distant 3 leagues from Salmon. And then he goes on and on like that, describing how we mapped out Canada. So when Champlain moved west, the giant river, they said they took him, the giant lake, it said it took him 3 days to canoe across. That's one of the Great Lakes. And then he inadvertently became embroiled in that conflict, which led to the Beaver Wars. So keep this in mind. And we'll cover that in due course. In the same year, in the Spanish sphere, we find the establishment of Santa Fe. So we will pause there, and we will pick up with the establishment of Santa Fe in the next presentation. For the moment, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.